When help comes from a creature you never believed in, do you let go of old hate or cling to it as the world falls apart? On a forgotten stretch of railroad, two hungry sisters, a lonely officer, and an unwanted German shepherd collide in the silence of a winter that just won't end. One touch, one act of courage, and everything changes. Resentments thaw, secrets surface, and lives begin to knit back together in ways no one expected. Stay with this story. You may discover that sometimes the miracle you need arrives quietly, on four tired paws. The morning settled over the Appalachian hills like a hush that never quite lifts. Light pressed pale and weak through the leafless trees, the world outside caught somewhere between frost and thaw. In the shadow of those woods stood a weathered house, its wooden siding faded to the color of old bone, porch steps bending under the memory of long-forgotten footsteps. Inside, Frank Leland woke to the sound of his own breathing and little else. The room around him was cold. The furnace hadn't kicked in yet. He sat up on the edge of the bed, pausing, shoulders rounded under a threadbare flannel, his hands rough from winters of work and loneliness. On the nightstand, a photograph in a frame, a woman and a child, both smiling into some vanished sunlight, a memory that caught the morning light but gave none back. Frank's feet found the floor. He padded through the house, the boards creaking their familiar protest. In the kitchen, he measured out coffee by feel, filled the pot, waited as it hissed and spat. The clock on the wall marked time with a slow, soft tick. There was no radio, no TV, just the distant call of a train's whistle threading its way up from the valley, breaking the stillness in a way that felt both foreign and inevitable. On the back step, Sable waited, old, black and tan, heavy through the haunches, one back leg turned just so, a limp that was more memory than wound. The German shepherd stood with his head up, eyes fixed on the mist curling through the trees. Frank pushed open the door. The dog's ears flicked. He shifted his weight, watching the man's every move as if every morning he was waiting to see if Frank might do something different. Frank hated dogs once. He'd told himself for years he wanted nothing to do with them. No barking, no fur on the furniture, no needy presence trailing after his boots. When his wife died, when his daughter was gone, he'd sworn off living things altogether. But when Sable showed up, battered, half-wild, a failed rescue K9 nobody else would take, something cracked just enough for the dog to stay. Now, the morning ritual. Frank slipped into his uniform, washed, mended at the cuffs, heavy with the badge of a town where everyone remembered and few forgave. Sable circled once, then settled at the door, waiting for the leash Frank still insisted on using. Not that the dog needed it. He'd learned long ago to keep his distance, to never assume affection. Frank poured his coffee into a dented thermos, the steam rising thin and fast. Sable's tail tapped once against the floor, the smallest question. Frank hesitated. There were days he still resented this animal, this four-legged shadow who reminded him of the things he'd lost and the ways he'd closed himself off. He saw in Sable's scars something too much like his own, too many close calls, too many times left behind. A part of him wondered if the dog was grateful for this afterlife or simply enduring it. Outside, the air was sharp, stinging his throat. Frank locked the door by habit, the house behind him silent. On the porch, Sable stood beside him, close enough to touch but never presuming, his breath fogging the air in little clouds. Frank sipped his coffee and watched the mist as it shifted and broke around the pines. Across the field, the tracks gleamed, a thin silver seam threading through the valley, carrying freight and echoes but almost never people anymore. The whistle sounded again, closer now, deeper, vibrating through the bones of the hills as Sable's ears pricked. Frank set down his cup, clipped the leash to the dog's collar, and together they started down the steps. No words passed between them. There never were. Frank preferred it that way. The town talked enough for everyone. They made their way through dew-soaked grass, Sable's limp nearly imperceptible unless you looked for it. At the edge of the yard, Frank paused, looking back once at the empty window, then forward to the long day waiting. Sable glanced up at him, eyes dark and unreadable. In that look, there was no judgment, no accusation. Only the simple patience of a creature who never questioned why he kept coming back to a place that had never quite made room for him. The pair walked on in silence. Frank's steps were slow, not from pain, but from something heavier, something he couldn't name. Sable kept pace, pausing only to sniff at a print in the dirt. The ghost of some smaller animal. The train's rumble reached them then, a low, rolling sound that filled the hollow places and left nothing untouched. Frank wondered, just for a moment, what the day might bring, whether it would be another page turned and left blank, another quiet defeat. Sable beside him did not wonder. He moved as if there was always something ahead worth finding, some new scent, some hidden grace. And as the sun struggled behind the clouds, the world felt suspended, waiting for something small to shift. Neither man nor dog spoke, but both, in their way, were listening. The rails stretched east and west like a scar nobody bothered to mend, rusted through with orange and brown, glistening where the dew clung on cold mornings. At this hour the tracks were empty, the last freight train having rumbled past hours before, leaving only a faint, metallic tang in the air. Just beyond the bend, Nora and Hazel Brody made their way along the stones and weeds. Their shapes were thin against the morning light, bundled in hand-me-down coats, boots worn smooth at the toes. They didn't speak much as they walked. There was no need. The routine was set. Search the grass for cans, old copper wire, any piece of metal the scrapyard man might give them a handful of coins for. Every bottle cap or pull tab was dropped in Hazel's sack, a small hope in a world that gave nothing for free. Their mother's night shift at the packing plant meant she'd be asleep when they left. The note on the counter, a scrawl of "Be good, love you" in blue pen, was proof enough that she cared. But there was no time for breakfast, no money for school lunches. Not this week. Nora split the last piece of bread, still crusted from yesterday's dinner, and handed half to her sister as they walked. They didn't mind the cold, not really. It was the silence they noticed most, the way the fog wrapped itself around the rails, muffling their footsteps, making everything seem distant. Nora glanced up at the trees, bare except for a stubborn crow perched on a wire, watching them with the suspicious patience of something that knows too well what hunger feels like. Hazel stopped, stooping to dig out a bit of crumpled foil wedged between two stones. Her fingers, already red and rough, worked the metal loose. "Put it in," she said, not waiting for an answer. Nora obliged, folding the foil into her palm, then into the sack with the rest. From down the tracks, a figure approached, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the slow, careful tread of someone used to walking alone. At his side, the German shepherd padded silently, body low, head level, moving like a memory through the morning haze. Nora's breath caught. She'd seen Officer Leland before, always at a distance, always with the dog. Some said he was strange, others mean. Nora believed neither, but Hazel, more sensitive to the whispers of grown-ups, moved instinctively a step behind her sister. Frank stopped several yards away, Sable at his heel. The old dog's nose twitched, catching the scents. Wet grass, rust, a trace of fear and hope on the hands of the girls. Sable didn't bark or tug. He simply watched, waiting. Frank's gaze drifted from the girls to the sack in Hazel's grip, to the scuffed boots, the matching knit scarves, one frayed, one still holding its shape. He let out a breath that clouded in the air. For a moment, he considered passing by. But Sable moved forward, a quiet decision in the dog's step, and so Frank let himself be led. Nora's eyes locked with Sable's first. There was something old in the dog's face. Lines above the eyes, a pale nick on one ear, a look that was neither fierce nor soft, just tired. She knelt, slow so as not to spook him, her gloved hand stretched palm up in the cold. Sable paused, then lowered his head, pressing his snout against her knuckles. It was not affection, not yet, only acknowledgement. Hazel watched, wary, arms crossed tight to her chest. She'd heard stories of dogs biting, dogs attacking, K9S dragging men to the ground in the parking lot after dark. But Sable's tail swept once across the stones, one single arc, and Nora smiled. Frank remained silent. He took in the picture. The two girls on the rails, the dog old and still, the morning settling like a question between them. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing over keys and coins, then pulled out a granola bar, crushed but still wrapped. Without a word, he held it out to Hazel. Hazel hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his, cold on calloused skin. She tucked the bar into her coat, looking everywhere but at Frank. The moment was short, but something in it lingered, a new shape in the morning. Frank gave a nod, barely more than a tilt of the chin, and turned away, Sable following. He didn't look back. Neither did the girls, but as Sable walked away, he paused, looked over his shoulder, and for an instant, Nora caught the glint in his eyes. Not suspicion, not threat, only a tired patience, as if to say, I see you. The sun pressed a little harder through the clouds, catching the rails and turning them briefly to silver. Four shadows, too tall, too small, stretched along the tracks, coming together for a single, silent moment before moving off again in their separate directions. In that quiet, the day felt a little less cold, the world a little less indifferent. The morning's chill lingered, refusing to loosen its grip on the valley. Along the rails, dew shimmered atop the weeds, clinging to rusty iron and broken glass like a last defense against the coming day. By mid-morning, the haze thinned enough to let the weak sun struggle through, painting patches of pale gold across the gravel. Nora and Hazel kept walking, their sacks growing heavier with scraps. Aluminum can tabs, bits of tangled wire, a glass bottle without its label. They paused now and then, kneeling in the tall grass, sharing the work in silence. For Nora, the hunt was meditative, her fingers skilled in pulling treasures from places others never looked. Hazel was more cautious, always glancing over her shoulder, as if the world itself might turn on them at any moment. On a stretch where the rails bent toward the river, Nora paused, tugging off her glove and flexing her cold fingers. Sable's scent lingered on her palm, a memory of rough fur and steady warmth. She looked down at her hand, tracing the faint imprint left by the dog's nose. The touch hadn't been affectionate, more a greeting, a quiet permission to exist together for a moment. Hazel, watching her sister, said nothing, but in her gaze there was a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not quite envy, not quite fear. A question maybe about what it meant to let a dog close, to risk that kind of softness. A crow called overhead, wings slicing the thin air. The tracks glimmered as the sun moved. From the far side of the trees, the faint sound of a car engine faded and disappeared. For a while there was nothing but the breath of wind through brittle weeds, the soft scuff of boots against gravel. Sable and Frank walked a different stretch of the rails, just out of sight, circling the edge of the old switching yard. Frank's face was set, unreadable beneath his cap. But every so often he'd glance at Sable, watching how the dog moved. Slow, deliberate, nose to the ground, every muscle tuned to something Frank could not sense. It occurred to Frank how much the town still talked about K9 dogs, how half the folks in the hills called them heroes, while others swore they were nothing but tools, made mean by training and disappointment. He'd once been the latter, and even now, even after all these years, the feeling lingered like a stone in his shoe. Sable stopped by a stand of cattails, sniffing intently, then sat. Frank stood behind him, squinting into the sun, watching a flock of starlings wheel over the field. The two figures, two girls, were just visible in the distance, small and bowed, nearly lost in the glare. Sable's ears flicked, but he did not move until Frank did. Back on the rails, Nora straightened, knees stiff from crouching. She brushed dirt from her jeans, then pulled her knit glove back on. Hazel's hands trembled as she emptied her sack, counting the fines by touch. It was a slow process, more ritual than necessity. They'd do it again at home, sorting metal from glass, laying it all out on the kitchen table beneath their mother's tired eyes. A gust of wind pressed against their backs. Hazel shivered, tugging her scarf higher around her chin. Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out the last piece of granola bar, breaking it in half, offering the bigger piece to Hazel. It was a small gesture, no ceremony, no thank you. Just the practiced habit of sisters who'd learned to share in silence. Down the rails, Frank and Sable drew nearer, footsteps crunching on the stones. Sable's limp was subtle, more a shift of weight than a true lameness, but Nora noticed. She watched as the dog's gaze swept the ground, then lifted to meet hers. The dog stopped, then sat, right on the edge of her shadow. Nora hesitated, then knelt beside him, removing her glove a second time. She reached out slowly, letting the dog choose his distance. Sable's head tilted. His eyes were dark and full of old pain, but he leaned into her hand, accepting the gentle stroke along his neck. Hazel stood back, arms folded tight across her chest, but her eyes didn't leave the pair. Frank, observing, slipped his hand into his pocket and found a battered granola bar, broken and crumbling. He crouched to Hazel's height, offering the bar without a word. Hazel glanced up, uncertain, but after a moment took it and tucked it away. In that small cluster of movement, hand on fur, bread exchanged, the quiet pulse of breath, the air seemed to soften just a fraction. Sable closed his eyes, tail tapping once against the rail. For a moment, time stilled. The girls, the dog, the officer, the rails shining beneath the sun, all held together in a fragile, nearly invisible web. The silence was not empty. It was full. Full of things unsaid, things hoped for, things remembered, and not yet mourned. In that silence, a kind of truce was struck, a first, tentative warmth in the cold. When Nora finally drew her hand away, she let it rest on her knee, the scent of dog clinging to her skin. Hazel took a step closer, curiosity wrestling with old warnings. The morning rolled on, the sun brightening, and for a moment there was no difference between them, all equally human, all equally alone, all bound, if only briefly, by the gentle weight of one animal's trust. Frank straightened, brushed grit from his knees, and with a last nod, turned to go. Sable lingered, looking once at the girls, then at Frank, before following. As the pair disappeared down the tracks, Nora watched them until the mist claimed their outlines. Beside her, Hazel's voice soft and almost lost. "Do you think he's always like that?" Nora didn't answer. She didn't need to. The warmth on her palm was answer enough. By midday, the sun had retreated behind a scrim of clouds, and the wind came down from the hills colder than before, stirring up last year's leaves along the porch steps of the Leland house. Frank returned from his patrol earlier than usual, the quiet of his shift unbroken except for the memory of the two girls and the dog's momentary trust. He hung his coat in the hallway, boots left by the door. Sable padded in behind him, nails clicking on the faded linoleum. Lunch was plain. A sandwich with cold ham, the end of a jar of mustard, half a wrinkled apple cut into thin slices. Frank sat at the kitchen table, its surface marked with coffee rings and old burns. He chewed slowly, looking past the steam rising from his mug of weak coffee to the picture on the opposite wall. His wife, her eyes bright and laughing. His daughter, leaning into her mother's shoulder, a crooked gap in her teeth. The age of someone who never had a chance to grow old. Both gone for years now. One to cancer, one to a winter's black ice. The ache was quieter these days, but sometimes the weight of those absences pressed down with no warning at all. Sable curled at his feet, head on his paws, watching the movement of Frank's hands, the rhythm of the meal. Occasionally, Frank dropped a crust for the dog, a habit formed in months of reluctant companionship. Neither man nor animal willing to admit they needed it as much as they did. Sable's tail thumped quietly against the floor, a silent thank you. In the afternoon, Frank carried his coffee to the small back room he used as an office. He opened the drawer where a badge and a service revolver lay, both clean but rarely used now, and beside them, a bundle of sympathy cards, yellowed at the edges. He ran his thumb over the top card, not reading, just feeling the slight ridge of handwriting. After a moment, he closed the drawer and sat with the silence. The ticking clock, the distant sound of the train passing through town, each noise a thread in the fabric of a day mostly spent alone. Across town, in the Brody house, the light was muted by sheets tacked over the windows, the glass rattling in its frame each time a truck passed on the distant road. Nora and Hazel sat at the kitchen table, spreading out their finds from the morning. Metal, glass, a bent spoon, a length of copper wire gleaming under the pale light. Their mother's coat hung over the back of a chair, a reminder of her exhaustion and absence more than her presence. She slept in the next room, face turned to the wall, hands curled beneath her cheek, as if holding on to something she couldn't name. The girls worked quietly, sorting and counting. Sometimes Hazel hummed under her breath, a broken tune she didn't remember learning, something that surfaced only when her guard slipped. Nora moved slower, tracing circles in the dust with her finger before placing each item into the right pile. When the last scraps were sorted, Nora wrapped a piece of bread in wax paper and set it aside for their mother. Hazel wiped down the table, her motions automatic. They both glanced at the clock. Still early, too early to wake her, too late to go back out for more. There was nothing to do but wait. Sable watched the afternoon slip by from the small rug in Frank's living room, his ears twitching at every stray sound. He listened for footsteps, for voices, for the signals of life that had once filled the house but were now rare and fleeting. Occasionally, he got up, padded to the front door, sat with his nose pressed to the crack, and waited for nothing in particular. The old dog's patience was inexhaustible. He could wait for hours, eyes half closed, lost in the memory of commands, scents, work. Days when the world expected things from him. Frank walked the rooms, sometimes with purpose, sometimes only to move. He straightened a stack of unpaid bills, watered the peace lily on the sill, poured another coffee he wouldn't finish. He looked through the window at the yard, brown and brittle under a thin coat of frost, and then at the tracks beyond, empty as ever. The house was too big for him now, but he could not imagine leaving it. He would rather live among ghosts than risk new disappointments. Late in the afternoon, Nora stood at the window in her room, watching a line of smoke curl up from a neighbor's chimney. Hazel lay on her bed, flipping through a tattered book, lips moving silently. In the stillness, every sound was amplified: the creak of pipes, the settling of the walls, the train's call echoing across the hills, a promise or a warning, depending on the mood. Nora pressed her forehead to the cold glass, her breath fogging a small patch. She drew a heart with her finger, then wiped it away before Hazel could see. There was comfort in these rituals, in marking the days, even when nothing changed. Back at Frank's, dusk gathered slowly, wrapping the house in gray. He fed Sable, watched as the dog licked the bowl clean, then sank again onto the rug, sighing deep into his chest. Frank lingered in the doorway, one hand on the frame, then finally turned off the light. In both houses, the night crept in quiet and persistent. Everyone had learned, in their own way, how to live with what was missing, to make do with what was left. And through the silence, Sable's eyes stayed open, vigilant and gentle, as if waiting for something, anything, to break the quiet. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened, turning the sky the color of old tin. A cold, metallic wind swept across the town and rattled loose siding along the abandoned rail depot. The rails themselves had lost their shimmer, now dulled beneath a gathering mist that signaled night would come early. Frank Leland's last patrol of the day took him and Sable along the more remote bend of the tracks, an area where the woods pressed in and the brush grew wild, dotted with the brittle bones of goldenrod and last summer's grass. Sable walked at his side, head low, nose searching the wind, as if the world was trying to speak in scents only he could read. Frank paused where the line curved toward the tree line, a place where even sound seemed to hesitate. The town was a mile behind them. Here all that was left was the whisper of wind and the soft, erratic ticking of metal as it cooled in the dusk. Frank shifted his weight, one boot grinding into the gravel. Sable stopped, his whole body going tense. The old dog's ears pricked forward, his chest rising with each slow, deliberate breath. Down the tracks, through the thinning brush, two small shapes moved, Nora and Hazel, still hunting for scraps, their bags slung low, backs hunched against the wind. The world seemed bigger out here, and the girls' voices, if they spoke, were lost in the rising hush. Nora stooped to free a piece of copper wire snagged beneath a plank. Her hands chapped red and raw. Hazel, trailing close behind, scanned the rails for anything left behind by luck or carelessness. Suddenly, Sable froze. A scent hit him sharp, a mix of metal, earth, something faintly bitter and wrong. He barked, one sharp note, then lunged toward the embankment, pulling Frank forward so abruptly that he nearly lost his footing. Frank cursed softly, but loosened his grip on the leash, letting Sable guide him down the embankment toward the edge of the woods. The brush parted to reveal a narrow, muddy ditch that cut alongside the rails. There, caught under a half-rotted board, Nora had slipped, her ankle wedged in a gap beneath the plank, her face drawn in pain and panic. Hazel was at her side, pulling at her sister's coat, her voice thready and desperate, rising and falling with each tug. The world shrank to the sound of her small hands scrabbling at wood and dirt, her breath coming in short, frightened bursts. Frank slid down the bank, Sable close on his heels. He moved on instinct now, boots slipping in the mud. He knelt beside the girls, his hands already searching for purchase along the slick, sodden wood. Sable pressed in close, nose low, licking at Nora's mud-streaked hand, his own body blocking the chill wind, offering what comfort he could. There were no words, none needed, none possible. Hazel's eyes met Frank's for a heartbeat, wide and wild. He nodded once, the only reassurance he could give, then set to work. His hands found the edge of the board, and he levered his weight against it, muscles straining. The wood groaned, reluctant, but finally shifted. Nora gasped, pulling her foot free, then curled around her ankle, breath shuddering in relief. Sable leaned in, licking gently at the bruise rising on Nora's skin, his eyes soft and watchful. Hazel, too exhausted to stand, slumped against his side, burying her face in his thick, warm fur. Sable did not move, did not flinch, only pressed closer, his slow heartbeat steady and reassuring. Frank checked Nora's ankle, swollen, painful, but not broken. He reached for Hazel, helping her to her feet, then carefully lifted Nora, cradling her in his arms. Sable walked beside them, body pressed close, guiding, guarding. Back up on the rails, the sky had darkened further. The wind carried the faintest note of a distant train, a sound more felt than heard. Frank glanced once at Sable, a look that held more gratitude than he'd ever admit. He understood, in that moment, that the old dog had seen and sensed what he, in his worry and weariness, might have missed. He had bridged the gap between suspicion and trust, not with noise or show, but with presence and patience. They made their way back toward town, the four of them bound now by something stronger than chance. Nora, wrapped in Frank's coat, leaned her head against his shoulder, eyelids fluttering. Hazel walked beside Sable, one hand gripping the dog's fur, her other clutching Nora's sack, refusing to let go. When they reached the edge of the woods, Frank paused, breath white in the air, and looked back at the place where the rails curved out of sight. In the fading light, it all seemed different, less threatening, more possible. Sable sat at his feet, tail sweeping the stones in slow arcs. No one spoke. The silence was full enough. It carried them home, through the deepening dusk, through the first real hush of winter. If anyone had asked, they would not have been able to say what had changed. Only that something had, a gentling, a beginning, a way forward that hadn't been there before, and for Frank, who'd learned too well the comfort of bitterness, and for Hazel, whose fear had long outweighed her hope, and for Nora, who carried her pain in silence, and for Sable, who had been waiting all along, there was, at last, a moment of belonging, made real by a single, desperate call and the quiet courage to answer it. The town's single streetlight flickered on as Frank guided the small group up from the tracks, its glow spilling across the cracked pavement and onto the Brody porch. Twilight had deepened, swallowing the edge of the woods in a blue haze. Frank's arms ached from carrying Nora, but he never shifted her weight or paused to rest. Sable walked in the half-shadow beside him, his limp more pronounced with every step. Yet the old shepherd pressed forward, always keeping pace, always steady. Hazel held tightly to the hem of Frank's jacket, her other hand still buried in Sable's fur. With each uncertain footstep, she seemed less a child and more a shadow stretching behind the others, trailing hope and fear in equal measure. At the Brody house, the porch light clicked on. Their mother, her hair pulled back, eyes smudged with fatigue, opened the door at the sound of footsteps. She froze at the sight, her oldest in Frank's arms, Hazel clinging to his side, Sable standing sentry at their feet. She said nothing, only stepped back to let them in. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the lingering scent of tea and old books, the kind of warmth that clings even when money runs thin. Frank knelt to ease Nora down onto the threadbare sofa, careful not to jar her ankle. Hazel sat beside her, silent but watchful. Sable padded into the room, circled and lay down at their feet, head between his paws, body curved protectively around the girls. No one told him to stay. He simply did. Frank fetched a basin of water from the kitchen, found a clean towel drying above the stove, and knelt again beside Nora. He dabbed at the mud on her shin, careful, gentle. The girl winced only once. Sable lifted his head, ears flicking in concern, and Nora reached for him, her small fingers curling into the ruff at his neck. The dog stilled, letting her hold on as long as she needed. The room was quiet, save for the faint crackle of the radiator and the wind outside pressing at the window. Hazel's eyes darted between Frank and Sable, as if trying to decide which one she could trust more. She edged closer to the dog, pressing her cheek into his side, her trembling hands finally quiet. Frank wrapped Nora's ankle in a strip of cloth torn from an old sheet, checking her color, the steadiness of her breath. Satisfied, he looked up to find the girl's mother watching him, arms crossed over her chest, face unreadable. She nodded, once, a silent thank you that needed nothing more. After a while, Frank stood and stretched his aching back. Sable, sensing the change, rose and gave a soft chuff. Hazel, without thinking, wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, holding on for one long heartbeat. Sable leaned into the embrace, then licked her hand, just once, a small benediction. Frank saw it all, and something softened in his face, a line erased from the tightness around his mouth. For years, he'd distrusted dogs, their unpredictability, their silence, their way of needing you without ever saying so. He'd carried that old prejudice like a badge, using it to keep the world at arm's length. But tonight, as he watched Sable tend to the children with infinite patience, as he saw fear dissolve into comfort with every quiet nuzzle, he let himself consider that perhaps he had been wrong, that a dog's gentleness could be as steadying as any hand, that love might arrive in the form of an animal who simply stayed. Nora drifted towards sleep, one hand resting on Sable's back. Hazel sat with her cheek on the dog's flank, eyes closed, a faint smile curving her lips. Their mother draped a blanket across their knees, brushing Nora's hair from her forehead with the gentlest of touches. Frank made tea on the stove, the scent filling the house. He poured 2 cups, handed one to the girl's mother, and sipped the other in silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the porch swing. Sable's tail thumped quietly against the floor. Later, when the night had deepened and the girls finally slept, Nora with her leg propped on a pillow, Hazel curled beside her, both anchored by the weight and warmth of Sable, Frank gathered his things. He paused at the door, looking back at the room. The girls safe, the mother kneeling at their side, Sable awake but restful, his eyes following Frank with something like understanding. Frank knelt beside the old dog, running a hand along his scarred neck. Sable looked up, eyes dark and calm, tail sweeping in a slow arc. For a moment the years fell away, the losses, the mistakes, the bitterness he'd clung to, and all that remained was the simple grace of being needed and being enough. Frank straightened, nodded to the girl's mother, and stepped out into the cold. Sable didn't follow, he stayed at the girl's side, as if he'd always belonged there. Outside, the world was unchanged, the wind sharp, the tracks silent, the stars hidden behind a curtain of clouds. But something in Frank felt lighter, unburdened. He walked home slowly, hands deep in his pockets, listening to the echo of his own footsteps and the memory of a child's arms around a dog's neck. And behind him, in the warm hush of the Brody house, Sable kept vigil, patient, gentle, a silent bridge between worlds that, for a long time, had seemed too far apart to touch. By nightfall, a hush fell over the house and the valley alike. The sky thickened to charcoal, the air turning brittle, dense with the promise of snow. The first flakes drifted quietly, swirling through the porch light, gathering in the hollows of the yard and on the warped railings. Inside the Brody home, the world contracted to a single room where warmth and silence pressed close, shutting out the storm. Nora slept, her breathing even, one arm draped protectively around Hazel. Hazel, too, had given in to exhaustion, her face tucked against the old dog's side. Sable remained alert, eyes half closed, ears twitching at each gust of wind that rattled the eaves. The girl's mother moved through the small house on quiet feet, banked the fire, checked the locks, then hovered near the sofa, unable to fully let go of her worry. Frank sat by the window, his uniform jacket draped over the back of a kitchen chair. He cupped a mug of tea between his hands, the heat seeping into his fingers. The light from a single lamp painted the walls in a gentle gold, turning even chipped paint and scuffed linoleum into something soft and forgiving. He watched the snow thicken on the porch steps, each flake catching the light before vanishing. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already hold. Relief, fear, gratitude, fatigue. Instead, the room breathed with small, steady rhythms. Nora's leg propped on a cushion, the slow rise and fall of Sable's chest. Hazel's hands curled into tiny fists, the mother's gaze moving from her daughters to the window and back again. When the wind howled, the girls stirred but did not wake. Sable's tail flicked, reassuring, and the mother laid a fresh quilt over them, her hands lingering a moment longer than needed. Frank stood to help, gathering logs for the stove, setting them in place with the care of someone who remembers when comfort was scarce and always temporary. The storm gathered strength, sheets of snow sweeping across the fields, battering the old glass. In the flicker of lamplight, the house became a world apart, fragile but whole. Frank sipped his tea and watched the mother brush hair from Nora's brow, saw Sable's watchful eyes follow her movements. He thought about how quickly things had changed, how suspicion had softened, how the boundaries between strangers had dissolved into something quieter, kinder. As the night deepened, Frank found himself reflecting on the day, on the years before. He remembered the bitterness he'd once felt toward animals, the certainty that dogs only complicated a life already full of grief. He remembered refusing Sable at first, resenting the dog's patience, his silent waiting at the door. Now, he saw how Sable moved through the world, never asking for forgiveness, never demanding trust, simply offering it again and again until the edges of old wounds softened. At the far end of the sofa, Hazel shifted, one hand searching in sleep until it found the warmth of Sable's fur. The dog didn't move, only exhaled a slow sigh, the tip of his tail brushing Hazel's bare ankle. Across the room, Nora murmured, lost in a dream, then stilled. Frank rose quietly, set his mug down, and walked to the door. He paused, listening to the storm's fury beyond the walls, the icy rattle against glass. He looked back, saw Sable's steady gaze, the girls curled in the glow of the lamp, the mother sitting at their feet with her head bowed. For a moment, the old ache pressed against his ribs, the loneliness of years spent guarding his heart from hope. But the sight before him, this makeshift family, drawn together by accident and need, held a different weight. Not the sharp grief of the past, but a slow, unfamiliar gratitude. He stepped onto the porch, pulling his jacket tight. Snow settled on his shoulders, melting into the thick wool. He breathed in the night, sharp, clean, edged with pine and wood smoke. The storm had covered the street and the yard, the rails barely visible beneath the drifting white. Above, the clouds glowed with the reflected light of town, but all was quiet here. The noise and judgment of the world held at bay. Inside, Sable stirred, rising to follow Frank's retreating shape. The old dog paused at the door, looking back at the girls, then at the mother, as if to reassure her that he would return. Frank turned, surprised by the dog's presence, and together they stood a moment in the shelter of the porch, watching the snow erase the scars of the day. Frank knelt, one hand resting on Sable's broad back. The dog leaned into him, warm and solid, a reminder that trust need not be spoken to be real. The wind howled again. The house shuddered, but in the small space between man and dog, there was a quiet that could not be broken. They returned inside, closing the door softly against the storm. The girls slept on. The mother dozed at their side. Sable settled once more beside them, his breath steady, the warmth of his body anchoring the fragile peace of the night. And so, while the world raged outside, the house remained a small island of light, a place where strangers became companions, where hurt became something softer, and where, for a little while, everyone belonged. The storm loosened its grip by morning. Gray light filtered through ice-laced windows, revealing the soft hush of a world remade. Every fence post and mailbox draped in white, the tracks reduced to twin shadows beneath the weight of snow. The house creaked as it warmed, the stove snapping and popping in the kitchen, a slow, steady music against the silence. Nora woke first, blinking at the unfamiliar comfort of a second blanket tucked around her shoulders, the gentle ache in her ankle reminding her where she was and what had happened. Hazel slept close, one arm flung across Sable's back, her face turned toward the old dog's steady rise and fall. Sable, sensing Nora's movement, opened one eye, lifted his head, and gave a slow, silent wag of his tail, a greeting with no need for words. Their mother hovered in the kitchen, boiling water for tea, slicing the last of the bread into thin, careful pieces. She moved with purpose, quiet but certain, her eyes softer than the day before. She paused to check Nora's ankle, murmured a question with a hand on her daughter's brow, then lingered to watch the girls and the dog together. The memory of fear was still there, bruised and unspoken, but gratitude had begun to seep in around the edges, coloring her view of Sable, of Frank, even of the world itself. Later that morning, Frank returned, boots crunching over the snow-packed walk. He carried groceries, flour, beans, a carton of eggs, all wrapped in brown paper, the offering of a man who never knew what to say, but wanted to help all the same. Hazel answered the door, half hidden behind the frame, Sable at her side. She accepted the bags with a shy nod, her gaze darting up to Frank's face and away again. Frank entered with a brief, awkward smile, stomping the snow from his boots. He knelt beside Sable, rubbing the dog's ears in the practiced, wordless way they'd both grown used to. Sable's tail swept a slow circle on the floor, then stilled. Nora called a thank you from the sofa, her voice thin but bright, and their mother gestured Frank to sit, her wariness blunted by exhaustion and relief. It became a rhythm, gentle and new. Frank visited every few days, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to check on Nora's healing, sometimes bringing an old deck of cards or a tattered storybook from his own childhood. Sable became a fixture, slipping easily between the Brody home and Frank's, moving from one patch of sunlight to another, finding warmth wherever it waited. There was no grand transformation, no sudden shedding of the past. The girls still squabbled over chores. Their mother still worried over bills. Frank still lingered by the window some nights, the old ache never fully leaving him. But there was a lightness in the house now, a sense of being seen, even in small ways. Hazel learned to mix dough under her mother's careful eye. Nora stitched a patch for Sable's old blanket, her stitches crooked but sturdy. The dog bore it all with patient dignity, stretching out by the stove, letting the girls braid his fur and press cold hands into his warmth. On weekends, Frank would walk Hazel through the basics of fixing her old bicycle, guiding her hands as she tightened bolts, his voice low and steady. Nora, still healing, sat beside Sable in the sun, reading stories aloud, her voice growing stronger with every page. Sometimes, when Frank rose to leave, the girls would cluster by the door, Hazel always hugging Sable goodbye, Nora watching with a quiet longing she never voiced. In town, word spread in the quiet, roundabout way of small places. Some wondered at Frank's newfound visits, his long conversations with Mrs. Brody, the way the girls always smiled now when they passed the station. Others noticed Sable more too, how the dog seemed gentler, calmer, his limp less pronounced as winter ebbed. There were still those who muttered about K9S, about dogs gone bad or broken. But the story in the Brody house was different. Here was a dog who healed and waited, who gave without asking, who belonged simply because he stayed. Nights grew shorter, days softer. The ice shrank from the edges of the yard. Water dripped from the eaves in slow, bright beads. On the first mild day, Hazel pressed her palm into a patch of sun and called Sable to join her. Nora watched from the steps, a smile caught in the corner of her mouth. Their mother leaned against the doorway, arms folded, eyes shining in the pale spring light. In these moments, quiet, ordinary, fleeting, the shape of their world changed. It was not heroism or rescue, not drama or triumph. It was trust, earned and returned in hundreds of small ways. A loaf of bread shared, a hand steadying a wheel, a scarred old dog pressing close when the night grew too long. In the gentle passing of winter, it became clear. Anyone, even the overlooked, the cautious, the once wounded could be seen, not for what they'd lost or feared, but for the quiet courage to begin again. And Sable, once doubted, now cherished, was the steady, silent witness to it all, carrying their secrets, their hopes, and the slow, patient work of healing home with every step. Spring settled quietly over the hills, not with sudden bursts of green, but with the slow return of life. A trickle of meltwater along the curb, daffodil shoots shivering against last year's dead grass. The faint, hopeful trill of songbirds staking their claims in the branches above the tracks. In the Brody house, the change was measured not in weeks but in gestures, subtle, accumulative, unremarkable to anyone but those living them. Nora's ankle, once purple and swollen, had begun to heal, the pain fading to a dull ache she no longer feared. With the first soft days, she ventured back outside, leaning on Hazel as they picked their way through patches of slush and lingering snow. Sable shadowed their steps, keeping a gentle pace, his limp a steady reminder of endurance rather than frailty. Their mother moved more lightly now, the deep lines of worry around her eyes softening, her voice warmer, even playful at times. She wrote a note and left it on the fridge the first morning Nora could walk without wincing. "We're getting through, one piece at a time." When Hazel read it aloud, the girls grinned at each other, and Sable, sensing the mood, nudged Hazel's hand until she laughed, bright and clear. One Saturday, Frank came by with a letter from the county clinic, inside a health insurance card and an appointment confirmation for Nora. He didn't linger for thanks, but the gesture shifted something in the house. Later, when he returned for supper, Mrs. Brody invited him to stay, her tone less hesitant, more sure. The meal was simple: potatoes roasted with a little onion, eggs fried in a battered skillet, bread fresh from Hazel's careful kneading. But there was laughter at the table, and even Frank found himself telling stories of his own girlhood in the hills, the memories softened by distance and time. Sable took his place beneath the table, head on Hazel's bare feet, tail swishing now and then. When dinner ended, Hazel fetched the scarf she'd been working on for weeks, a patchwork of soft grays and bold, uneven letters that spelled SABLE across one end. She knelt, slipping it over the old dog's neck. The scarf hung crooked, the stitches clumsy, but Sable sat tall, eyes bright, as if understanding he'd been given something that mattered. No one spoke their gratitude. They didn't need to. The acts themselves, the meal, the scarf, the silent understanding, were enough. In the weeks that followed, Frank's world, too, began to thaw. He found himself opening the old house to Mrs. Brody and the girls, inviting them for Sunday lunch, for card games around the kitchen table, for slow walks by the tracks with Sable and Hazel leading the way. His own loneliness faded into something quieter, less sharp, a backdrop to the gentle noise of company and the steady comfort of routine. One afternoon, Nora brought out a tin of biscuits she'd made herself, awkward and lumpy but warm. Hazel chased Sable around the muddy yard, her laughter ringing through the open window. Mrs. Brody sat with Frank on the porch, watching the girls, a mug of weak tea in her hands. She spoke softly, of worry and hope, of the difficulty of accepting help, of how she'd once braced herself for pity or judgment, but found only patience, room to breathe. Frank listened, not offering answers, only his presence, his quiet nod, the shared history of surviving and missing what was lost. Later, when the evening air cooled, Hazel pressed the new scarf into Sable's fur. Nora draped an old blanket over the porch steps, and the girls huddled together, watching dusk gather in the trees. Sable settled between them, content to let Hazel braid his fur, to lean into Nora's steady hand. In these quiet moments, kindness flowed without need for words, the trust of a child leaning against an old dog, the gift of food prepared with care, the quiet act of listening. Frank saw his own change reflected in Sable, once wary, distant, unsure of belonging, now patient and quietly proud, bearing the girls' affection and the household's noise without complaint. For both man and dog, healing came not as a revelation, but as a slow accumulation of ordinary mercies. In town, the story spread. At the market, Mrs. Brody returned the kindness in small ways. A loaf of bread baked for an elderly neighbor, Hazel carrying groceries for Mrs. Little across the street, Nora volunteering to read to children at the library. None of it was announced. None of it remarkable, but people noticed all the same. On the first true day of spring, Frank brought Sable to the Brody house with a bag of garden seeds, a tin of paint, and an old sanded bench. Together they painted the bench a pale sky blue and set it by the front steps. Sable lay at their feet, the scarf around his neck bright against his dark fur, his eyes half closed in the sun. As evening fell and the shadows stretched across the yard, Hazel knelt and hugged Sable. Nora squeezed Frank's hand, and Mrs. Brody smiled quietly, watching the family they'd built, unexpected, imperfect, but theirs. There were still worries, still scars, still quiet nights when loss pressed close. But now, in place of silence, there was a gentle, persistent kindness, moving through the house and out into the world, a warmth that asked for nothing, gave everything, and lingered long after the day was done. By the time the first true warmth of summer touched the hills, the tracks at the edge of town shimmered beneath the haze, grass grown tall along the rails, wild daisies nodding in the wind. The old scars of winter had faded, not erased but softened, the land gentled by time, as if it too had learned the slow work of healing. Frank Leland's hair had turned another shade of silver, but there was a new steadiness in his step, a quieter ease to his days. Most mornings, he could be found on the porch with Sable at his feet, the two of them sharing the hush of sunrise. The old dog's muzzle had gone white, his limp more pronounced on damp mornings. Yet his eyes shone with the steady, alert kindness that had come to define him in the eyes of the whole town. Across the street, the Brody family moved through their days with a rhythm both new and familiar. Nora, her ankle now only faintly sore, riding her refurbished bicycle along the sidewalk. Hazel trailing behind with Sable at her side. Their mother baked in the early hours, windows thrown open to let in the scent of grass and new bread, the old fear in her voice replaced by gentle laughter, a softness that colored the air of the house. On one bright morning, Nora and Hazel arrived at Frank's house with a basket of fresh biscuits and jam, Sable trotting ahead to claim his spot on the porch. Nora's cheeks glowed with sun, her eyes clear, and Hazel's hair was wild in the breeze. They didn't knock, the door was open, and they had long since learned they were welcome. Frank brewed coffee and poured lemonade for the girls. They all sat together in the soft shade, the old blue bench painted by their own hands now nestled beside the steps, its surface chipped but sturdy. Sable sprawled at the center, head on Nora's knee, his body soaking in every touch, every quiet word, every easy laugh. The conversation was spare, the kind that flows between people who trust the silence as much as the words, who know that company, not noise, is what matters. Sometimes the only sound was the whistle of a distant train, its call neither lonely nor urgent, just a part of the land's slow, unhurried pulse. Hazel braided dandelions into Sable's scarf, her small hands deft and careful. Nora read aloud from a battered storybook, the pages turning with a soft rustle, her voice low and steady. Their mother joined them, setting down a plate of sliced apples, her hands resting on the shoulders of her daughters. She looked at Frank, not as the officer who once brought only warnings, but as a neighbor, a friend, someone whose presence made the day easier. Later, as the sun crested the roof and the shadows retreated, they walked together to the old tracks, each step measured and unhurried. Nora wheeled her bicycle beside her. Hazel skipped ahead, Sable's tail wagging in the sunlight. They stopped where the rails curved away from town, the grass high and wildflowers bright beneath the sky. From a paper bag, Hazel produced a handful of seeds, zinnias, cosmos, wild asters, gathered from Mrs. Little's garden, a neighbor's small kindness passed on. The girls knelt together, pressing seeds into the dark earth along the tracks, their laughter drifting into the stillness. Sable nosed the ground, then settled in the shade of a flowering dogwood, content just to be close. Frank and the girl's mother sat on the bench, their voices barely above a whisper. They spoke of nothing important, weather, recipes, small-town news, but the warmth in their words, the absence of strain, was the clearest sign of what had changed. There was no need for confessions, no search for meaning in old pain. It was enough to simply be there, side by side, in the quiet grace of the day. When the work was done, Nora tied a ribbon, a scrap of blue cloth once belonging to her mother's dress, around the slender trunk of a new sapling, planted just beyond the rails. It was a small thing, nearly lost in the sweep of grass and shadow, but to those gathered, it was a marker of time past, of wounds tended, of hope quietly sown. Sable circled the sapling, sniffed the ribbon, and lay down at its roots. Hazel nestled against his side, eyes closed, breathing deep. Nora sat cross-legged in the grass, watching a butterfly settle on her knee. Frank leaned back on the bench, the light soft on his face, the years of solitude softened by the gentle weight of belonging. As the sun lowered and the air cooled, they lingered together. No hurry to go, no need for parting words. The whistle of an evening train sounded in the distance, rolling over the hills like a memory, not a threat. In that moment, everything seemed to pause, pain and loneliness and old judgments set aside, replaced by the quiet certainty that even the smallest kindness can change the shape of a life. And so, in the drowsy light of late summer, with wildflowers blooming along forgotten tracks, and a faithful old dog at the center of it all, something quietly miraculous unfolded. Not the end of sorrow, nor the promise that nothing would ever hurt again, but the assurance that light can find its way through even the smallest cracks, and that in the company of gentle souls, human or animal, the world can, at last, feel like home. When the last train passed and the light faded from the rails, what remained was not the memory of hardship, but of hands reaching for one another in the cold, of trust built slow between scarred souls, human and animal alike. Sometimes the greatest changes in a town, a family, a heart, begin with the smallest act, a child's touch, a meal shared, a dog who simply stays. If this story has found a place in you, I invite you to share a memory or the name of a companion, human or animal, who once changed the way you see the world. What small kindness, what silent loyalty has made a difference in your life? Your story may be the hope someone else is waiting to find. Thank you for walking this journey with us. May you carry its warmth wherever you go.